for today's session, Fons, I would like us to have a conversation that I think will be very relevant to many people in business.
Yeah.
It might also be relevant to people in other organizations, but my focus is in business. So let me tell you a story of a recent conversation I had with somebody. A wonderful dilemma, I think. So this client of ours says, Morris, you know I'm Jewish. I said, yes. And says, I have colleagues in my organization. Some of them are Jewish too. Okay, good data point. And then he says, you know, the ongoing conflict in Israel and the Gaza is a source of deep pain for me, because my Torah teaches me that all life is valuable. And whilst I fully am horrified and scared about what happened in October, on October 7, in Israel, I'm equally horrified about what's happening with the continued bombing by Israel of the Gaza and the loss of life. And he says, yeah, the challenge is, I don't believe it's proportional. But that's not the problem. The problem, he says, is I can't have this conversation with my colleagues at work. Because one of my colleagues, he says, his son is in the Israeli Defense Force. And as we speak, he says, Morris, this son is in the war. He's in the Gaza, on the ground. So if I have this conversation with my colleague, there are risks to our relationships as colleagues. One. Two, if I have this conversation outside of my home, outside of me and my wife and children, there are risks to me in my community, because I run the risk of being misunderstood and being cast out in my community. So it got me thinking, what we're now facing is people inside their community and organizations really struggling about, how do I live my authentic self? Because that's what we want, isn't it? We want you to live your authentic good self, if I can put it that way, for the best outcomes of an organization, without a fear of harming relationships in the workplace, without the fear of harming relationships in community. And then it got me thinking, it feels like people are struggling with this, even when it's got nothing to do with the specific facts, let's say, of the Ukraine or the specific facts of Israel. Suddenly, if you're trying to do business in the US, part of the due diligence is, what are your beliefs? And how do these beliefs inform the service that you're going to provide? When you're doing business in Europe, what are your beliefs? And we see in your country now, is also in a bit of confusion, state of confusion, with the latest political situation with the new elections. So how do we help business people frame these facts or this context in a helpful way to help them to navigate their personal relationships, their organizational relationships, their business relationships across borders? I thought this would be a wonderful conversation. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, Morris, I think, first of all, you touch upon an issue that increasingly happens because of the diversity of the world. While in the past we had separate groups separately, but now it is everywhere. The Jews are everywhere, the Arabs, the Islam, the Dutch, the Japanese are mixing everywhere. And you gave some very recent examples. You know, what we found in general, and let's then trying to translate that to your examples, which obviously is very complex, because emotions are involved. It's not rationally we can solve any problem. Power is involved. Who is the most powerful in what? Yeah. And especially the power issue and the emotional issue are things that hinder rational solutions to a dilemma. Okay. So let me give you, first of all, some principles of the game of dilemmas. Because I've been often asked, even before the war exploded since October 7, are there ways to solve that dilemma where everybody that has a human feeling, like you just expressed yourself, can at the same time understand Israel and understand Palestine? Let me speak for myself. I do understand both. But there are currents under that of people who don't want to understand it and just say there is only one goal, and that is to erase a country from the river to the sea, right? And if that is your belief, which is an assumption that is indisputable, then there is never a solution. Now, the rules of the game are the following: that whenever there is diversity of insight, start with what you share. And very often I take the pendulum as an example. The pendulum can swing in diversity if it has a nail that holds it together. And the quality of the rope that connects the sharing with the diversity is the quality of leadership. Okay. Very often we focus, also in my job, to explain what the differences are politically, belief systems. But you said an interesting thing in your introduction, Morris, is that the person from Israel, the Jewish person, said, do we, as human beings, not all respect life? Okay. Now, that is already a tricky assumption, because I think in different religions, we think differently about life. But as an example, that's why at the same time you can believe what happens in Gaza at the moment by bombing is as awful as what happened on October 7, namely the respect for human life. Okay? Now that connects. Now, this is one example, but there might be other examples. We all like to have a private space to live that is safe. That's what we share as well. Now, I don't think, but now I'm giving my personal opinion that perhaps the politics lately in Israel, which, by the way, many Jews would agree with me, is not the most positive for creating a space where people feel safe in where they live. But the point I'm trying to make in dilemma management, start with what you share, which then allows you to look with perhaps less emotion and passion about where you differ. And we see in Dutch politics that in our latest elections, we have not taken enough attention to what we share in the Netherlands. But also the stereotyping, which is another way to focus on differences that are indisputable but exaggerated, lead to a situation where you don't feel that those dilemmas can be reconciled. If you see now how the left parties react on the right-wing parties, it's all stereotypical. It's all, these are extreme rightish people. To be honest, there is even in the party that won, very leftish parts as well, but they're ignored right now. Let's translate that to business.
Yes.
If you have headquarters that goes to a discussion about standardization with a local operating company, I would say, hey, we are part of the same company, right? But the locals are saying, and they stereotype, oh, headquarters always want to standardize, always want efficiency, always want this, that, and the other, and they don't understand the local customer, right? Then you talk to headquarters, yeah, as a defense mechanism of standardization, they always say we don't understand the local company, and they never make enough money locally, and the excuse is that we don't understand the local customer, and they stereotype, right? While if you would start by saying, what is our joint purpose? May I give some examples? I've seen
Absolutely.
companies with purpose that unites people regardless of standardization versus customization as a discussion of diversity, is, can we connect Africans in a better way so that it increases wealth for Africa? And it doesn't matter if you're in Cameroon, in Ethiopia, or in Johannesburg, South Africa, you say, wow, we all share that, right? I know organizations like even Walmart that says we want to enable less to-do clients to buy the same things as well-to-do clients in terms of finance. If you have that purpose, then you say, wow, we're all in the same game. So one advice, and you can translate that to politics, but is first look at what you share, and purpose in business is therefore enormously important. And the support to that purpose is values. Then the dilemmas that you face are suddenly much emotional emotional, because you say, but they are there to serve our purpose. And that would be one advice. So
I'll just maybe push back a little bit, because ironically, I'm hearing you. Between the two of us, you're the psychologist, I'm not. And yet you are, it sounds like you are diminishing the value of emotion, when in fact, I would think there is value in emotion. So there's a difference between emotion and emotional, if I can put it that way. So emotional is where you are not being rational, if as an antonym for rational, whereas emotion can be rational. So in other words, how do you use that emotion to arrive at a rational outcome? And so I'm just, because I think a lot of the conversations, so even if I look at it in our South African context, when you get people talking about, do they support the African National Congress, or do they support the Democratic Alliance, or do they support the EFF, there's a lot of emotion in that conversation, socially and in business. But if you ignore that emotion, I feel you are staying in the superficial. But if you acknowledge that emotion and use the acknowledgement of that emotion and navigate through a form of emotional intelligence, you arrive at rational outcomes, and outcomes that surprise us. And so I'm wondering whether in the spirit of dilemma reconciliation, is there a space for using emotion as a rational tool, as opposed to emotion as a non-rational tool?
No, that's a very, very good point. By the way, I'm in complete agreement with you. We in business very often define a dilemma as two positives that you both want. But at first glance, the one positive seems to exclude the other positive, right? The same for emotions. You know, the positive of an emotion is called passion. The negative of an emotion is called hate. Now, the point I was trying to make, if emotions, especially the negative ones, overwhelm, then it's very difficult to get passion out of the game, because I purely believe that purpose can give you the right emotion and the right energy to reconcile the dilemma. There's nothing better than passion. You know, I very often get young students who come to me and say, Ms. Trompenaars, I love your work in the area, in the space of cultural diversity, taking advantage of it. Would that be something for me? I said, the fact that you come so passionately to me is already a good start, because if you can combine a good sense of living rationally and you combine it with your passion, you're in great shape, right? So I'm not negating what you just said. On the contrary, I think emotions are tremendously important, but let them be positive emotions rather than negative ones. Because I've seen, if we link it to politics again, hatred is so bad in the reconciling of emotions, because people stop listening, stop trying to have empathy of what is happening on the other side. You know, why are Israelis doing this? Why are Palestinians doing this? Hatred is almost closing your eyes and putting cotton into your ears. It's just one way or the highway. It's my way or the highway, and it's not very helpful. That's the point I was trying to make. It's the negative.
So then I'm taking to say, let's begin with common ground. What do we have in common?
Yeah.
What is our common purpose? And let's amplify the positive dimension of emotion. You use the word passion. I want to suggest it leads you to the next phase of compassion. And I suppose when we get to compassion, we start thinking about the mechanisms of compassion without losing ourselves. So because compassion doesn't mean that you are right and I'm wrong. Compassion for me says, I feel my pain, but I also acknowledge your pain.
Yeah.
And so we are sitting together in each other's pains, and we're recognizing each other's pain, and we're inviting each other to work through our respective pain towards a common purpose.
Oh, you know, are you sure you're not a psychologist? But you know, you sounded for a moment like Mandela, and I don't know if he used these words, but it sounds like Mandela, who is a fantastic icon of this type of thinking. Now, may I go back to our steps of dilemma reconciliation, yeah, and see what you just said fits into that pattern? Yes. So the first, and I'm going back to rationality now. So yes, in business we say, what is your dilemma? And the funny thing is, by asking people what is your dilemma, you already invite them in saying, hey, there might be another viewpoint. Perhaps it's not mine, yeah, but you're already in formulating the dilemma, acknowledging that you share something, namely the dilemma. Okay? That's not step number one. So if you say, may I stick to the same example? On the one hand, we need to standardize and create economies of scale. On the other hand, we need to listen to the local client and customize, right? Then you say, oh, wow, we in Cameroon are sharing the same thing as in Johannesburg. And however, we believe that our dilemma starts with, in Cameroon, with the customization, while in Johannesburg, it starts with standardization, right? So the dilemma is already the beginning of what we share, okay? Second step is, let's what we call crack the line. And cracking the line is an invitation. If the vertical axis is globalization, standardization, and the horizontal line is localization, customization, you say, oh, wow, that is a dilemma that invites you to combine if you crack the line, right? But then now I'm coming to the point I want to make, and that is step number 3, and that is how can we put some positives and some negatives on the y-axis and some positives and negatives on the x-axis. And that is an invitation to show that any side has positives and negatives. So the positive of standardization is lowering cost. The negative side of globalization and standardization is lack of flexibility, right? The positive of localization, customization, if you like, is you listen better to clients, to local clients. And the negative side is it's very expensive. Okay? Now, why we're doing that is to say, you're not better than I am. Right? We both have pros and cons in the way we approach things. Now, then in step number 4, and we don't ignore the negative, we exaggerate the negative, so you don't want to be there. So in position 110, top left-hand corner of the dual axis, we have my way or the highway. Or if you like, we use very often metaphors like the T-Ford as a car brand. You may use any color as long as it's black. The famous expression of Henry Ford. On the other extreme, you have the Aston Martin. Very expensive, but customized, right? And you say, yeah, but it's unaffordable. The unaffordable Aston Martin. And perhaps in the opposite of my way or the highway, you say the Tower of Babel. Everybody speaking their own language. Cameroon, Ethiopia, Ghana, but nobody understands each other. So we take the negative to an extreme to say, this is not working. And then that's the final 2 steps. Step number 5 is asking, how can we combine the positives? By asking the question, what can we do with what we learn in Cameroon that helps our organization to become a more global, standardized outfit? And an example of that, and now I'm going to the action point, step number 6, is we should have regular meetings where local operating companies combine their best practices, which we make into next practices that are so good that we can globalize them and making it our standard. So all the things you were mentioning, Morris, are in that process. You include the negatives so you avoid to be there. You combine the positives by saying, how can X give me more of Y? How can Y get me more of X? Which, by the way, is very counterintuitive. And then you come to a sharing, which is called the reconciliation. And and then the concrete action points how to get there. Let me stop there, but in 5 minutes, I've been trying to give you all the steps of dilemma reconciliation that might be working.
So I'm going to go back then to my, how can I say, highly emotional example, deeply painful example. Because now I'm hearing that if we take the dilemma reconciliation framework and apply it to a business context in that scenario, when we acknowledge people's pain, the emotion is also about saying we also need to allow for listening, allow for reflection, allow for that pain to be articulated. So when you're talking about, let's plot the negative and the positive aspects of a particular practice or a particular approach or a particular scenario, that's the inviting time for listening without judgment, listening without choice. Because then you're inviting people to say, in as much as I want you to see me, I am seeing you.
Yes. I couldn't say it better, Morris. In fact, I would do worse than you. This is exactly why we do the step 3, which we call stretching. You stretch both the positives and the negatives. And may I give you how would you call that, a footnote? And the footnote is, why don't you force the group? Let's say there are people of headquarters that are passionate and perhaps even compassionate about reducing costs through standardization, right? And the local operating people passionate about serving the local client better, even if it costs a bit more, right? If you invite the people of headquarters to make the positives, the possible positives of the other party, namely, what do you think in Cameroon could be positive about serving the client optimally, right? And you ask the people from Cameroon to go to headquarters in Johannesburg and say, could you say something positive about standardization, right? Then you, and vice versa, you swap their mind in trying to understand, and empathy is enormously important to understand both positions better. And then you create a real sharing, like, gee, we could play a role to help them, and vice versa.
So in your many years of work with many businesses across many parts of the world, how have you seen this empathy developing as a capability in business? What has been the evolution of this mechanism called empathy? To go back to 1990, for example, then you fast forward to 2010, then you fast forward to today. So kind of like big leaps of time. And to get a sense of, I remember, we both know I'm slightly younger than when I started working in 1991, empathy was not part of the toolbox of management, I can tell you. And yet today it has to. What has been the evolution for you?
Yeah, I wish I could give a more positive reaction on what you are asking me than I will now. Namely, if I see a development, it's not really very positive. And let me give you some hindrances to empathy. It's the anonymization of giving an opinion. You know, I'm trying to summarize what is happening with social media. What people say about each other, with not claiming responsibility for what they say, has been a very negative, almost revolution. What people say to each other. You know, what I feel today, including in business, is because of the increased communication, but this is societal, which is anonymous on top of it, has led us to believe that minorities are majorities. The opinions of minorities have been blown up to, and very often negative ones, to people thinking that it's the majority thinking that. You know, if you see what Twitter and now X is doing with opinions of anonymous people, and suddenly everybody talking about it, and it becomes the major talk of the town, has not been helpful in the development of empathy, right? And that is worrying me. Although I'm not against social media, it's fantastic. But like all the big things like now artificial intelligence, it is fantastic unless you use it badly by deep fake and what have you, right? So if you ask me, between 90 and now, has there been an enormous improvement in empathy? I would say no. Now, the opposite is that when we do dilemma reconciliation with clients, what on the one hand excites me, but also worries me, is they said, gee, we never had such a good discussion. Even if they don't reconcile the opposites. They said, the methodology has allowed us to say what we want without being immediately hammered down by the others, because it was done in the context, hey, it's a dilemma and both sides are okay. And normally we're not used to it. My wonderful colleague Charles Hampden-Turner once said, when I asked him, Charles, what is hindering people to not normally using dilemma reconciliation as part of life? And the opposite is polarization, right? Which is also the opposite of being empathetic. And I've only seen increased. And he said it looks like our brain is liking to choose between one side or the other side. And I said, but Charles, is there not hope? Because I agree with him, although he's 20 years older than I am. He's 89. I'm lying a little. It's 19 years of difference. but
it's a small dilemma. Small dilemma.
It's a small dilemma. And he said, you know, I'm very optimistic about more females in the top of the house, because females, and I checked this, by the way, Morris, I checked it with a neurosurgeon, who is the most, at least in the Netherlands, the most famous guy, Erik Scherder. And I checked with him, could it be, and I explained that we believe also in our research, no, not believe, we know females are better in reconciling dilemmas than men. And I said, the corpus callosum, the tissue between the brain halves of females is bigger and more active. Females are much better to go left, right, while men is rather left or right. And he said, yes, our research shows the same. that very often now both are important. So I'm not saying put only females in the top of business because you get other problems, right? But the combination of male and female without males being dominant is where we need to go. I hope that is helpful, because also I think females are much more empathetic than men. But I know people who have developed empathy so much that they stop giving their opinion. They're just empathetic. They're useless. Now I was going on artificial intelligence. Say, what is the opposite of empathy? And that is assertiveness. So the combination of empathy and assertiveness is where we need to go. And yeah, I hope I'm not talking too much around your issue, but
oh, it's fine. I'm happy to bring it back to my my current curiosity. So I suppose, Fons, what I'm trying to get anyone who's watching this, who is troubled by how do I navigate the world and the complexity in which we find ourselves, I have to give them some guidelines. So far we've said, find a common purpose that can hold you together. Seek to stay in the passion and compassion component of that journey. Seek to be, that's step 2. Step 3, seek to acknowledge each other using your stretching part of the steps. Seek to acknowledge each other by acknowledging both the positives and negatives of each other's perspectives. And celebrate both. and 4, seek to see how you can bring the positives of each of your perspectives together. And then as you seek to bring these together, there's a new state that you're moving towards. You're moving towards this dilemma reconciliation state. And as you are breaking through that dilemma reconciliation state, hopefully you are able to navigate your personal relationships, your organizational relationships, and your business relationship across cultures. I wonder, as we try to bring this to a close, Fons, whether when you've worked with, let's say, that local versus head office logic, has there been a new logic? And I know the term might be local, but at a cultural level, has there been a new logic that you've seen emerge? We spent a lot of time on empathy, but are there other mechanisms that are helping to emerge a new logic post-reconciliation? Who are we post-reconciliation?
No, that's a very good point. And to be honest, when we have served clients in this type of thinking, some were tremendously successful, and they have created a new logic. And that is to create a continuous dialogue which is constructive. And we call that the transnational organization, if we focus on this dilemma. But this applies to many things, right? I've also seen organizations doing this as a workshop, tick the box, thank you, Mr. Trompenaars, and they go off and they fall back into their old position. Yeah. What is the difference? And the difference is really leadership. We have found that great leaders like the Mandelas, like the Gandhis, are leaders that continuously do this, right? That's one. What we are trying to do at the moment, Maurice, is to go to secondary school and perhaps more implicitly primary school, so that people are taught at young age to not say, oh, this is good and this is bad. Hey, perhaps both are okay. And so in Amsterdam, for example, we have tried to do this, and we're still trying to do this for the teachers of international schools. because they are the leaders of the young ones. And they're now inviting us to look at their study materials, if they can implicitly put some of that stuff at young people. So the point is, yes, I've seen a transition, first of all, and it very often starts with the CEO and the board. If they believe in it, it's downhill skiing. That's one. And what we want to do on a more structural level is to get young people to do it. Because, you know, wonderful organizations like GIBS and, you know, other type of executive education, it's obviously helpful, but it's still counterintuitive. And we want to make it intuitive and say, hey, can we live this world in a more sustainable way than just doing it through a little workshop? Yeah. But leadership, servant leadership, is essential. You know, and again, I'm mentioning Mandela as what he has done is just amazing. But you see how difficult it is to make it sustainable.
Wonderful. So, Fons, I think in the next conversation, I want us to move from the nail to the rope. Because I think in this conversation, we've been talking about the quality of that nail. And now we need to talk about the quality of the rope, which is the leadership, what you frame as servant leadership. And then maybe unpack some of the attributes of servant leadership from a dilemma reconciliation framework perspective, some of the practices, and also possibly some of the dark sides. So you mentioned one of them, having empathy without assertiveness, for example, would be the dark side of servant leadership, because that servant leadership becomes a doormat, right? You know, as opposed to becoming a tray. You want to be the tray and not the doormat. You want to be providing service, not to be trampled on. And so I think we do need to kind of explore this more fully as the next phase of a conversation about how to navigate in a fractured world, how to navigate in complexity in which we find ourselves.
Oh, great. And I might think of the title, The 7 Dilemmas of Servant Leadership and How to Reconcile Them, of which the meta dilemma is serving and leading.
Yeah.
And then we'll go through 6 other ones that need to be reconciled, because we did some research, Morris, about what are the major dilemmas that leaders face. And we come to 7. We have a database of 48,000 dilemmas. And if you analyze them, it comes down on the level of leadership to those 7. And let's have that discussion next time. That would be wonderful.